Hey guys, thanks for joining me. Let's give it a minute and we'll go ahead and get started after that. Stand by. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Happy Thursday. Welcome everybody. Welcome Will. It's a new agent that just joined this week. So Will Haggins the fourth. Welcome to White Rock. So today is the Thursday that we delve into a training topic. And so if you do want to chime in, you'll have to unmute yourself. But I wanted to cover today top 10 things that your buyers tend to overlook during a transaction. And the reason why this is kind of timely is because there's such a shortage of inventory and buyers are either willingly or forced to make decisions in haste or decisions they would not normally make otherwise. So today is the top 10. I could do like a top 100 if truth be told. But we're going to review some of the finer points. Before we do that, just as a reminder, our website that is customer facing, so whiterocktexas.com, it's looking real good. For those of you that have not sent me a headshot, please go ahead and do that so we can replace the realtor logo and have a great looking picture of yourself in there. So just as a reminder to do that. So number one that buyers tend to overlook or selectively hear in the transaction is the level of urgency. And so you would be surprised at the lack of level of urgency that there is amongst many buyers. They don't realize that there are deadlines to meet. Earnest money, option fee, get an inspector in there, all sorts of things, right? And so all the to-dos within the option period, inspection, repairs, title commitment. I mean, Texas is one of the few states in the country that actually allow for an option period, which is to say that the buyer can just wake up one day within that first, whatever you agreed upon, 7 days, 10 days, and just change their mind. So that is a big deal. And so the next is the level of urgency in the loan process. So from the day that that contract is executed, begins the process of getting that person from a pre-qualification status to the loan is approved status. That is a very urgent time frame. Okay, so not just the option period, but the actual loan process itself. Okay, and I had that in big bold letters because I think buyers just assume that it's going to work out. And we're going to talk about the loan process a little bit in more detail a little bit later. All right, and then the financing approval. So the financing approval is different than the pre-approval process or the pre-qualification process. So in order to go out and look for a home, the buyer typically gets with their lender, and based on a verbal of what their loan or what their debts are and what their income is, the loan officer says, okay, well, based on that, you are qualified for X amount of home, right? But the financing approval is within that third-party financing addendum where you typically put 21 days to get approval. That means underwriting. That means, are you lying to me type of deal, right? So that is kind of lumped in here with a level of urgency because loan officers will ask the buyer for lots of stuff in that financing approval period. And a lot of times buyers don't realize that that is a big deal to get that to them. All right, so in order to impress upon the buyer that, look, the next 30 days, we're going to be running 90-0, and that's normal. But please don't, discount the fact that there is a heightened level of urgency between now and the time that we close. And so in my opinion, I would get the 1 to 4 out, and I would highlight with a yellow highlighter personally and review with them what those deadlines are and why they're important, and emphasize and repeat. If your loan officer asks you for something, no matter how difficult it is to get, or I'll add in there, no matter how insignificant you, the buyer, think it is, I would assume he wanted that yesterday. Okay, every delay can impact that closing date. So things like if they request something that has been paid off already, then they want proof of it. If the buyer is using a gift as a part of the down payment, all that has to be buttoned up and proven. And so even though the buyer may think that he or she has proof, and until the loan officer has it, it doesn't exist. So again, if the loan officer asks your buyer for something, assume that they wanted it yesterday. Okay. All right. Number 2, how fluid and volatile the loan process is. So as I mentioned earlier, a pre-qualification letter is not the same as a loan approval. All right. That 21 days, beginning with the effective date, is the let me see how much you were lying to me phase, right? So this is the let me prove, loan officer, let me prove that this loan can actually close based on your credit score, me running your credit, how many debts you actually have, what your income really is. If you're dealing with a person that's self-employed, it can get tricky. All right, so as a buyer's agent, it is well within your right, and I encourage you to always stay in touch with the lender. Okay, they will likely give you the same information they're giving your shared client. Okay, so it's important that you stay on top of the loan process and the loan officer to make sure that there are no surprises. Okay, and so ask point blank every time you call, what do we know now? When did we know it? Okay, is there any surprise since the last time we talked? Okay, and then impress upon your buyer anything can happen that may impact the loan process or closing, right? So what was tracking to be on schedule yesterday, that may actually change. Hence the reason the title of this one is how fluid and volatile the loan process can be. And so no news does not necessarily mean good news in the loan process. All right. So both you and the client have to stay on top of what might be changing. Okay. A client's credit score is the starting point of risk. The lower the score, the more risk there is always. So just to reiterate, the loan process is not necessarily volatile or fluid if the buyer has a W-2 job, they have a low debt to income ratio, they're not taking out an FHA loan, and their credit score is good. Okay, so let's reverse that. If their credit score is on the fence, if they're self-employed, if they have a ton of debt, cars, student loans, that type of thing, if they are choosing to keep certain things secret from the lender, you are dealing with a high risk client. All right. And so if any one of those things is a fact in your buyer transaction, they need to know, because they may think that it's not any big deal whatsoever. Okay. All right. Number 3, earnest money risk. So they don't typically understand the fact that the earnest money is already factored into the cash out of pocket or their down payment, right? So in the 1 to 4, in paragraph 3A, that's the cash portion of the sales price, right? So they're going to have to come out of pocket for something, unless it's a VA loan. And so that cash portion, part of that is now going to be written in check form to the title company as the earnest money, right? We all know this, but the buyer does not necessarily know this. They sometimes think it's above and beyond what's in that first line, okay? They also don't understand why it's so important to the seller to see a large amount. So if it's a $300,000 home, and we're typically putting down 1% as the earnest money, which in this case would be $3,000. In this kind of market, it's important that we're putting down maybe more than the 1%, $4,000, $5,000. At a high level, it just seems like a number on a piece of paper. But to the seller, it represents what they're going to get if the buyer defaults or screws up some way at some point in that contract process. Okay, so this could be the difference between getting the home or not, because in this market, the higher the earnest money, the more serious the buyer appears to be, right? Because the seller might get that money if something goes wrong. All right, and then that is a good segue to my next point, which is they don't understand exactly what could happen to risk losing that money. Okay, so if the buyer defaults in some way that results in that earnest money being forfeited, I'm not sure that a buyer always understands that. Okay, so it's our role to explain it. So articulate the top reasons why this can get forfeited. So if you don't close on time, that's one way, and it's the buyer's fault. If they don't get financing approval in time, so if you've put 21 days and they can't get financing in time, they risk losing that money, or if the buyer just simply backs out. That is more common today than you realize, because again, buyers are being somewhat forced or strong-armed into getting a home that they haven't had a whole lot of time to think about whether it's the right home for them or not. And they're afraid to push back. And all of a sudden, we get deep into the transaction and the buyer panics and just wants to back out. And plenty of them do, but they risk losing their earnest money. If they're past option, there's no other reason for them to back out and get their money back. They're going to lose it. And so I don't think that they entirely realize that. Number 4 is a title commitment. A lack of understanding regarding what is covered, what title insurance actually is, and what the exclusions mean. So if you're with us in mid-December, we had a 2021 business planning session where our in-house title company explained what all of this means. And so if you are not familiar with that, obviously become familiar with it or get the title rep involved. All right, and then secondly, why it's important at all, how it protects the buyer, and why their lender might be requiring they will require a second title policy. So in any transaction where there's a loan, the seller pays for a title policy, but then the buyer pays for one as well, as requested by the lender. Okay, and that's because the lender wants to be in first position to collect on that mortgage in case the buyer defaults. But it's only on the loan amount, not the sales price. The seller's policy is on the sales price. Okay, so our action to kind of prevent this from happening, get the title rep involved to explain the document. All right, and then know how to read a survey, recognize encroachments, and understand where in the title commitment the exclusions are and what might raise a red flag. Okay, at the end of the day, the home can't be conveyed with a cloud on title anyway. So the title company is going to clear any lien. But one of the things we talked about in mid-December is if there are any heirs involved. In other words, if there has been a death somewhere down the line, the chain of title, that can delay the closing. So this is why overlooking the importance of a title commitment and title insurance is a big deal. Okay, so even if you don't understand everything about a title commitment or title policy, at least get on the phone with the title company that issued it and ask, are there any red flags? More importantly, are there any heirs that need to be cleared up? Right, number 5, everything on page 4, which page 4 meaning of the new version of the 1-to-4 contract. Now on page 3, and I have it in front of me, there is language about HOA and statutory tax districts, so the same thing applies. So why do buyers overlook this? It's because nothing needs to be checked and nothing needs to be filled in. And so I'll throw us in the mix there as well. I think that we tend to overlook this page until we're forced to. So things like, is the home in a PID, which is a property improvement district, or a MUD, which is a municipal utility district? Is it in a propane gas area? Are there transfer fees? Notice of water level fluctuations. So again, typically we don't look at this until we have to. Now, there are 2 other entities in the transaction that should catch this. One is the lender, one is the title company. But it's important to understand if the home is in a PID or is in a MUD, which is actually very common. Okay, it's important because there's extra costs on a monthly basis associated with that. Okay, number 6, doing a walkthrough in time. In time for what? In time to close. So everyone assumes that if there's a repair amendment, it's just going to get done and there's going to be no issues. But that is not the case a lot of times. Okay, so oftentimes a buyer doesn't do a walkthrough until it's too late for the seller to do anything about it. And oftentimes they're stuck with subpar repairs too close to closing. Now, there is a reason why there's a 1-pager in our contracts that is the buyer walkthrough. And it's usually 2 boxes. Buyer waives the right to do a walkthrough, or buyer has done the walkthrough and there's no issues. This has happened twice to me in the past 60 days, that the buyer does a walkthrough and they don't, it's the day before closing and something has gone wrong. And that can create stress and a problem. So our duty is to stay on the seller and make sure that there's language in the amendment that says that repairs have to be done a week before closing. I wouldn't have it done. I know it says they got to be done by closing, but to me, that's too wishy-washy. I think that if you're doing a repair amendment, I think there's a couple of things that have to be included in there. One, they have to be done 7 days prior to closing. Two, you want to see receipts for everything. Okay. And this is why you should always be specific when writing those repair amendments. So let's say that there are no repairs to be done, but there were seller exclusions, and we've talked about this before. So if they are removing wall mounts for TVs, or valances for window treatments, that's going to leave holes in the wall. So if there are exclusions on behalf of the seller, you now then as the buyer's agent have to do a repair amendment that says, make sure the holes are repaired once you remove the valances or TV mounts. Because if you don't, then they will likely not do them. Okay, and so you don't want your buyer walking in on moving day to a catastrophe. Okay, number 7, they don't understand sometimes how sacred the closing date really is. Okay, so there's a reason why in the 1 to 4 it says we'll close on or before this date. Okay, and in the spirit of wanting to get something pushed over the goal line, people always assume it's 30 days. And oh my gosh, I can't go 35 or I'm not going to get the deal. Well, depending on what's involved in that transaction, you actually may want to do 35 and just walk it back and say, look, we're going to be able to close before, on that 30-day mark, but I want to make sure that we give ourselves enough room to get certain things done. Okay. Remember, this is why it's awesome to be a seller's agent because usually the buyer is the one that has all these balls to juggle, right? And rarely is a delay in closing due to something the buyer themselves has actually done. It's usually the lender or the title company or a repair person. I mean, I can't tell you how many times a roof had to be replaced and they weren't going to be able to get it done until after closing. That can't happen, first of all, not something that big. So you don't ever want to wait for a repair to be done and close before that repair is done. All right, and so everything has to be buttoned down before that closing date happens. And so hence the reason why that date is so sacred. And so if the lender needs something or a title company can't clear something in time by closing, man, we got to know about it well in advance because it is horrifically difficult to change the closing date. Okay, so this date is sacred. If it's moved by one party, the other party has the option of not signing that extension. And so that, then one party's in default, right? And now, mind you, common sense would suggest that both parties are invested. They don't want to back out. But in a market like it is today, when a seller has a line of people wanting to buy that home, it's more likely that they're going to say, we got a backup offer. We got a backup offer behind the backup offer. We don't need these shenanigans. We're out. And oh, by the way, you've defaulted and you're not getting your earnest money back. So this date is sacred. It's not, well, we might hit that date, we might not. That can't happen. Okay. Think of it this way. I mean, movers are lined up. Leases from apartment complexes are being wrapped up. And other parties on down the line are going to be severely and irreversibly impacted if that closing date is not met. All right, so timeliness counts. Emphasize to your buyer that this date is non-negotiable. All right, number 8, risk of a lease back. All right, so this is pretty common today because a seller is anxious to sell their home. They're seeing dollar signs because your offer was above asking price, and they're feeling good about life. But the challenge is they have no place to go, and or they do, but it's going to take them a few days or sometimes a few weeks to get there. And so basically what you have is the buyer closes on that home, and now you have the old seller squatting in that new buyer's home, technically, right? And the way the lease backs are written, it's pretty gray as to who's responsible for what. And so, what if something breaks down? Who pays for that? What if the sellers don't move out because their plans fell apart? What if they leave the place a disaster? What if fill in the blank? I mean, a billion things can happen with a lease back. So it is always, always preferable for the seller to leave on closing date and the buyer to move in on closing date or the next day after. So, but if a lease back isn't unavoidable, if you can't avoid it to get the deal done, I would not do one longer than 3 days. I've seen them lately be like 2, 3, 4 weeks or more. And I just wouldn't do that. Anything can happen. Pipes could break, air conditioning could break down, and Mr. and Mrs. New Buyer have the old seller knowing that they're going to leave anyway, and maybe not treat their home the way they treated it when they lived in it originally. So I would be wary of a lease back, and please school your buyers that there's risk here. All right, number 9, paragraph 12 of the 1 to 4. This is under settlement expenses, okay? And in this paragraph, a credit is not really a credit, is it? So this would be where the buyer would want help with either closing costs, or if a carpet allowance was being given or something popped up on the inspection report that the seller didn't want to handle, and they just said, look, we'll just give you an extra couple of $1,000 and you can fix it. It's common for windows to be in that category, by the way. But the buyer often thinks that they're going to get a big fat check. I'm sorry, the seller. No, sorry, the buyer is going to get a fat check written to them at the time of closing. That is not the case. So no money is ever written inside or outside of closing directly to the client. All right, so it's always going to show up as a credit to whoever the credit is being applied to. Okay, so that is a big misconception sometimes on behalf of the buyer. Additionally, even though the buyer may have that money earmarked to replace the carpet or windows, it never goes to that specifically. Okay, it always goes to a credit. And you need to be aware that there are maximum amounts allowed based on what kind of loan that buyer is getting. So especially if it's an FHA or a VA loan, the seller may want to give the buyer a $10,000 credit, but it may not be allowable as per the loan. They may only be able to get half of that. Okay, so it says, I'll bring up paragraph 12 in a second, but it says that whatever amount you put in there, if what you're using it for with regards to closing costs doesn't get you to that total amount, the rest of that goes away. So if the buyer gets a $5,000 credit and only $4,000 of it can be applied, that $1,000 goes away. So they may or may not be getting that full credit. It is a use it or lose it scenario. All right, so, but what I would do is explain to the buyer that it is cash, and you're going to have to come out of pocket for some cash anyway to close. And so explain that the cash they would normally have to come out of pocket for to close is now being absorbed with some of this seller credit. All right, they can then take that cash that they would normally have to come out of pocket for and get the carpet redone, get the windows fixed, etc. I mean, cash is cash. There's just a certain way you go about it with regards to accounting for it. So here's paragraph 12. And it says what it can be used for, by expenses payable by buyer, appraisal fees, loan application fees, um, origination fees, that's a big one, credit reports, preparation of loan docs, interest on the notes from the date of disbursement to 1 month prior to the dates of the first monthly payment, recording fees, et cetera, et cetera. So there are lots of fees that will add up. It's just a matter of, will they add up to the entire amount that they're being given a credit for? Okay, so buyers sometimes don't think of it that way. They think it's free cash, and that's not the case at all. Okay, number 10, the long-term impact of an appraisal waiver. So this is becoming more and more prevalent, and get ready because it's about to get ugly, in my opinion. So here's the normal scenario. Home goes on the market. Buyer, in order to get the home, wants to offer above list price. Well, the seller says, well, that's risky because it may not appraise for that full amount, but you're welcome to come out of pocket for whatever extra you want to pay. But just to make sure that you're not going to force me to lower the price, I want you to sign an appraisal waiver. And the waiver says either full waiver, I don't care, whatever the appraisal comes in at, I'll pay the difference between that and what I'm offering, or option 2, it has to appraise for at least a bottom amount. And usually I suggest putting in the sales or the list price. Or option 3 is, I think it can appraise for any less than a certain amount, or something like that. So buyer goes and says, okay, I'll fill this out. And the short-term impact means that obviously they have to make up the difference. So if a $300,000 home only appraises for $250,000 and they've offered $350,000 and they've checked box 1, they have to come out of pocket for $100,000. So you can see where the short-term risk is in that scenario. Okay, but the bigger impact comes long-term when, if they're paying above asking price, they are by default paying more than the home is worth, usually. Right now, they may think, okay, well, it doesn't matter, I just want to get into the home. Well, it's going to matter 3, 4, 5 years from now when they try and go and resell it, and they paid more for it than it was worth, and now they can't get for it what they paid for it. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen or to what degree that's going to happen, but it is going to happen. I mean, if a buyer's paying $10,000 above ask, maybe there's some wiggle room there, but that is the low end of what I'm hearing. I'm hearing $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $80,000 above list price. So if sellers are already pushing the envelope on what the list price is, anything above and beyond that is going to be even more risk. So the buyer needs to know that, I mean, unless they're staying in that home for the next 10 years, there could be some risk if they go to resell that home because they're already overpaying for it. All right, so our duty is be sure they understand what the implications are by agreeing to this. And, they don't have to. I would suggest that they find another home or just wait to buy something, unless they have to move. There is no harm in stepping back from all this frenzy that's going on if they feel like they're being financially compromised. Okay, and sometimes they just need to hear that. So those are my top 10. I have 2 bonuses. Bonus 1 is lack of transparency with the lender. They don't realize sometimes that their financial situation is going to get revealed anyway. There's nothing the lender is not going to uncover. So, the loan officer gives a pre-qualification letter based on what the client has told them verbally. All right, that 21 days allows underwriting to look underneath the hood for defects or obstacles to closing that loan. Okay. Oftentimes, things that pop up will take the client by surprise, and they are innocently surprised, right? I'll bet if I looked at my credit report right now, a report that I haven't looked at in probably 15 years, there'd be stuff on there that I didn't know was on there. Same thing happens. But, you know, come on, you know how much you owe in student loans. You know that, you know, you went through a bankruptcy 10 years ago. You know that you're self-employed. You know. And so buyers sometimes hold back on stuff that they're embarrassed about because they don't think that it's going to impact the loan process. All right, so it does. So our duty is to discuss the need to be upfront with the loan officer regarding debts, total income, dings on their credit report. You know, man, better to find out in the first week than find out in week 3. And this goes back to what this could jeopardize. You know, closing date, earnest money. I mean, it could be a train wreck. And let me tell you what, if you find out about this on day 21, day 22, think of how that seller is going to feel because their home has now been off the market for 21 days. And do you think that they're going to be open to giving that earnest money back? No. So please impress upon your buyer the need for transparency with the lender. All right, bonus number 2, they can't sue. Okay, theoretically, in the contract they have signed to engage in mediation. So a lot of people like to throw around the lawsuit threat, and this only really happens when emotions get high. But let me just redirect us back to paragraph 16 where it says mediation. By the way, this also goes for any commission dispute. So I've covered this before, but don't let another broker or agent threaten you with a lawsuit because they think that they should be paid or not paid or something. That's a lesson for a different time. But as it relates to the transaction, it says, it is the policy of the state of Texas to encourage resolution of disputes through alternative dispute resolution procedures such as mediation. Any dispute between seller and buyer related to this contract, which is not resolved through informal discussion, which means going back and forth and say, hey, give me a break. Can we not come to some kind of agreement? That's an informal discussion. Okay? Anything that's not resolved in that way will be submitted to a mutually acceptable mediation service or provider. They are inexpensive, by the way, a few $100. It then says, though, this is where people usually push back, the parties to the mediation shall bear the mediation costs equally. And so people like to pop off at the mouth and threaten lawsuits and all that good stuff. And it's interesting how they're really not interested in the spirit of resolving the issue. They just want to stay mad at somebody, right? And that usually reveals itself when it comes time to split the $300 fee it costs to pay a mediator, which I think is ridiculous. And just FYI, what happens in a mediation is a third party who is skilled at doing this brings everyone together. They may, meaning buyer and seller, they may ask for our documents, they may not, and they try and work it out. And meaning each party is going to compromise. And so if that is not the case, then obviously they can go on to litigation. And that's where paragraph 17 comes into play. The buyer, seller, listing broker, other broker, or escrow agent who prevails in any legal proceeding related to this contract is entitled to recover reasonable attorney's fees and all costs of such proceedings. So that's just more of a disclosure. If it does get to a lawsuit, then one side can go after the other side for those fees. But you know, if your buyer in these examples ever threatens a lawsuit, you know, you need to push back and say, look, it doesn't work that way. It's mediation first, it's lawsuit second. And whenever they start talking about, well, I don't care how much I'm going to lose, it's the principle of the matter. You're dealing with someone that's not thinking rationally. Okay, it's not ever the principle. Not when you weigh what's right versus who's right. All right. So anyway, that's my little soapbox on mediation. So any questions on the top 10? I know it's kind of somewhat ugly out there with some of these things. Anybody have any input or stories they want to share? No. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you, team. Appreciate your attendance today. And next week will just be a traditional office meeting, and then we'll rotate out that following week with another subject. I've got some things lined up, but don't forget to send me your headshots if you haven't already. Don't forget to review whether or not you want a website for yourself in a CRM. It's $15 a month. I think it's well worth it, but no obligation whatsoever. Just give it some thought. So anyway, thank you guys. I appreciate it. And we will see you next week. Have a good one.